Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there. You ready to dig into this? You sent us a really interesting collection of articles and notes, all about a time when the Cold War took a turn for the, less icy. We're talking about Détente, that period in the mid-20th century when the US and the Soviet Union decided to, maybe, just maybe, give peace a shot. So what we're going to unpack today is what drove these two superpowers to even consider burying the hatchet, and what impact that had, for better or worse, on the world.
What's fascinating about this period is that it wasn't just about signing treaties, it was about a fundamental shift in the global chessboard. Imagine. For decades, the world was holding its breath, wondering if the next international incident would be the one that ended it all. And then, suddenly, a change in the air. Of course, this wasn't some random act of kindness. Détente was a calculated risk, fueled by a potent mixture of fear, economic realities, and maybe even a bit of global pressure.
A potent mixture is a great way to put it. So we're talking late 1960s, early 70s. The Cold War is in full swing. Both the US and the USSR have enough nuclear firepower to turn the planet into a cosmic barbecue. Where on earth do we even begin to look for the roots of détente in all of that?
Well, one event casts a long shadow over everything else. The Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. That near-death experience for the entire planet was still fresh in everyone's minds. It underlined the very real danger of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as it became grimly known. The stakes couldn't have been higher.
It's almost like they were playing a game of chicken. But with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, no wonder they finally decided to try talking things out. But it wasn't just fear that brought them to the table, was it?
Absolutely not. The Soviet Union, in particular, was struggling under the weight of its own military ambitions. Their economy, heavily skewed towards defense spending, was starting to creak at the seams. Think about it. By some estimates, almost a quarter of their entire economy was being poured into the military, leaving other essential industries and consumer goods woefully underdeveloped. They desperately needed access to Western technologies, especially in areas like computing and agriculture. Just to keep pace, Détente offered them a way to do that without breaking the bank.
So by easing tensions, they could potentially modernize their economy without completely bankrupting themselves. I can see how that would be tempting. But it wasn't just the Soviets who saw an upside to détente, right? The U.S. had its own reasons for wanting to thaw things out.
For sure. Remember, the U.S. was bogged down in the Vietnam War, a conflict that was draining both their resources and public support. Détente offered a way for them to strategically disengage from that quagmire, without appearing weak on the global stage.
It's incredible how these major events, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, created this perfect storm that pushed both superpowers towards the negotiating table. But let's get down to brass tacks. What actually changed during Détente? What did this thawing of relations actually look like in practice?
One of the most significant developments was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, better known as SALT II. In 1972, this was a landmark agreement because, for the first time, both sides agreed to actually limit their nuclear arsenals. Now, this wasn't about eliminating nuclear weapons entirely, but it was a crucial step towards getting that terrifying arms race under control.
It's almost unbelievable. After decades of frantically building up stockpiles of weapons that could wipe out civilization, they finally hit the pause button. I have to admit, it's hard to wrap my head around that kind of shift in thinking. What do you think was the turning point? That moment when both sides realized this couldn't go on?
It's difficult to pinpoint a single event, but the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation certainly weighed heavily on everyone's minds. But it wasn't just about weapons. Another key development was the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which were less about military hardware and more about establishing some ground rules for how these two rivals would interact on the world stage. Think things like human rights, economic cooperation, and even recognizing the existing borders in Europe. It really is remarkable, isn't it, on the surface? These agreements seemed like a genuine leap towards a safer world. But the question is, were they just a temporary fix? Did they truly live up to that promise? That's what we really need to unpack here.
It does seem like there's more to the story.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the impact of détente. Did it actually work?
It's complicated. Détente wasn't some kind of magical solution to the Cold War, but it definitely had a real, tangible impact. For the Soviet Union, gaining access to Western technology and getting some breathing room for their economy was huge. And for the U.S., it helped pave the way for them to eventually extricate themselves from the quagmire of Vietnam, although the conflict itself dragged on for a few more painful years.
So, some definite wins for both sides. But you're saying there's another side to that coin.
Exactly. While détente may have dialed down the temperature, It didn't put out the fundamental ideological fire that was raging between these two superpowers. And let's be honest, those high-minded principles laid out in the Helsinki Accords, the ones about human rights, well, the reality on the ground in the Soviet Union often told a very different story.
A bit of a disconnect between the agreement on paper and what was actually happening in people's lives. I can see how that would create tension.
Absolutely, and those underlying tensions eventually bubbled to the surface. By the late 1970s, things were starting to unravel, and the event that really shattered the fragile illusion of détente was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979.
That was a pivotal moment, wasn't it? It felt like all the progress made during détente just evaporated overnight.
It was a devastating blow. The U.S. saw it as a betrayal, proof that the Soviets couldn't be trusted to play by the rules. President Carter, who'd been committed to détente, responded with sanctions and even went so far as to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
A stark reminder that even the Olympics, this global event that's supposed to be about unity and sportsmanship, couldn't escape the gravitational pull of the Cold War.
Exactly. And with that, the so-called thaw of détente was officially over. The 1980s ushered in a new era of hostility, with Reagan ramping up military spending and famously labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire.
So, détente, this hopeful experiment in easing tensions, ultimately couldn't bridge the ideological chasm between these two superpowers. But even in its failure, I imagine there are valuable lessons to be learned. How do historians make sense of this period? What's their take on the legacy of détente?
It's a fascinating debate that's been going on for decades. You have historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. who argue that détente was absolutely crucial in preventing nuclear war. They point to the arms control agreements and the simple fact that, well, we're all still here to talk about it.
Hard to argue with that.
Right. But then you have revisionist historians like Gabriel Coco who offer a much more critical perspective. They see détente as being more about serving U.S. economic interests than genuine peacemaking. Their argument is that the U.S. used détente to essentially integrate the Soviet Union into the global capitalist system, which, in their view, ultimately weakened the Soviet system from within.
Wow, two very different takes on the motivations behind détente. Was there any other major schools of thought on this?
Absolutely. You also have post-revisionist historians like John Lewis Gaddis. They tend to see détente as a sort of pause button on the Cold War, a way to lower the temperature without fundamentally changing the game or the players. Gaddis, for example, argues that the ideological conflict was always simmering beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to erupt again.
Which, of course, it did.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how even decades later, there's still so much debate about this period. But for all the different interpretations, it seems like there's a consensus that détente wasn't just about abstract ideas and diplomatic maneuvering. It was also deeply intertwined with what was happening inside the Soviet Union, especially their economic struggles. In fact, we haven't even touched on the insights that came to light after the Cold War ended, when historians finally gained access to previously classified Soviet archives.
That was a treasure trove of information, for sure. Historians like Melvin Leffler were able to dig into those archives and uncover the internal pressures and motivations within the Soviet system during this time. One of the most significant takeaways was just how much of a role economic stagnation played in pushing the Soviets towards détente.
So those internal struggles within the Soviet system, particularly their economic woes, were a crucial factor in their willingness to come to the table in the first place. It really highlights how much we often miss when we only focus on the surface level of international relations.
Exactly. It underscores the fact that even during the Cold War, things weren't always as black and white as they seemed. International relations weren't just about ideology and military might. They were also deeply influenced by these internal, often hidden domestic concerns.
It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story than meets the eye. Détente, it turns out, was about a lot more than just arms control talks and diplomatic handshakes. It was this complex interplay of economics ideology and internal politics, all playing out on a global stage. But as we're talking about this, it makes me wonder, are there echoes of détente in the world today? We're facing some pretty intense geopolitical standoffs right now. Are there lessons we can learn from this period of history?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question that historians and political scientists will continue to debate for years to come. But I think it's safe to say that détente reminds us that even when countries are grappling with things like nuclear proliferation, competing economic interests, and deep ideological divides, dialogue and diplomacy are still possible. It shows us that even sworn enemies can find common ground, even if it's just that shared desire to avoid mutual annihilation.
A powerful reminder that sometimes talking is preferable to, turning the planet into a radioactive wasteland. But as you alluded to earlier, détente also teaches us that diplomacy, while essential, isn't a magic wand.
Exactly. It's not enough to just paper over the cracks. For there to be lasting peace, you need to address the root causes of conflict, whether we're talking about economic disparities, political oppression, or deep-seated ideological differences. Détente may have hit the pause button on the Cold War for a while, but it didn't solve it. Ultimately, it took major internal changes within the Soviet Union to truly bring an end to that global standoff.
It's a lot to think about as we try to navigate the complexities of our own world, détente. A fascinating and cautionary tale of cooperation competition, and that ever-present threat of conflict all playing out in the shadow of unthinkable destruction. Really makes you wonder, what will future historians say about our attempts to find peace and stability in the 21st century? That's something to ponder, isn't it? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into détente, a period that continues to resonate in ways we're only beginning to understand.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.